Alan, thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be here. It's excellent to be here just after the tea break because you've all drunk your tea out of ware made in Stoke-on-Trent. Churchill China is a very, very good company based in Tunstall. So what I thought I would do is reflect on the interaction between history and politics and history, and the role of a sort of public historian within that, thinking, and I can never get to the bottom of this, maybe you can help me, whether it's J.R. Seeley or E.A. Freeman, who said that history is past politics and politics present history. And I want to begin really, as I've just done, to think about where history and politics combine, which is in the Palace of Westminster. Looking onto the ruins of Westminster in 1941 after the bombing raid by the Luftwaffe, where the key decision was made of, do you save the Great Hall, do you save the medieval hall, or do you save the chamber, and then let the chamber burn rather than the medieval hall. Churchill famously said, "We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us." And his argument was clear. He wanted Parliament rebuilt in all its essentials as it has existed since the 1840s. The building itself, he felt, was a part of democracy, its history shaped by the politics. Designed in the 1840s, as you know, by Charles Barry and Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, the Palace of Westminster was consciously created as a testament to British identity in a period of unprecedented change. The medieval palace had itself burnt down in 1834, but rather than celebrate the Industrial Revolution with a modernist design, the architects returned to the past with a medieval Gothic aesthetic. Pugin decked out the new palace in a riot of gold, crimson and gilded extravagance, although one of the interesting things of the nature of the palace is we always think it's a celebration of democracy. By far the best work begins with the royal quarters, and then it goes to the House of Lords, and by the time they get to the House of Commons they sort of pretty much run out of interest in the design and wealth. But we had, of course, then this famous competition in the 1840s to commission the historical paintings, the frescoes, to go around the palace. And they were commissioned to highlight the long and uninterruptedly increasing prosperity of England as the most beautiful phenomenon in the history of mankind. But this was also a consciously British building, and it became, as it were, more British during the course of its construction. Above Central Lobby, at the heart of Westminster, the saints of England, Wales, Ireland and Scotland formed the defining mosaic. It was also an imperial edifice with frescoes depicting heroic moments in Britain's global march, the conquest of India, death of Nelson, the triumph of Wellington at Waterloo. Westminster explicitly endorsed the colonial certainties and moral determination of Victorian Britain. In its art and sculpture, it was a place of manufactured historical identity, a veritable Valhalla to democracy. And at the heart of this history, at the heart of this story of history and politics, was the English Civil War. So as I rush into the chamber, as I did today, to hear the latest words of wisdom from George Osborne, I walk through Westminster Hall, where the trial of King Charles I took place, and then past the statues of John Hampden, of Edward Hyde, Earl Clarendon. And if I wish to go into the House of Lords, I go along the Peers Lobby corridor and I see the frescoes depicting King Charles I raising his standard at Nottingham, the Battle of Basing House, and then this sort of incredibly sentimental depiction of the burial of the White King. And if after all that exertion I step outside for a breather in Westminster Hall Gardens, there in front of me stands Old Noel himself, the statue of Cromwell put up in 1899, which almost sort of split the Liberals. History is all about us, and yet one of the frustrations of contemporary politics is also an unwillingness to reflect on the lessons of that past. My view, as you would expect, is that history provides us with a collective memory. It gives us a sense of connection to time, place and community, and it also behoves us to study the mistakes and mindsets of our forebears. In 2003, on the eve of the Iraq War, the then Prime Minister Tony Blair travelled to the United States Congress to announce that, quotes, "A study of history provides so little instruction for the present day." before then going on to repeat some of the classic historical errors of British action in the Middle East. George Orwell's 1984 had it more right. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. So as a historian turned politician, I thought I might reflect and then have a conversation on various areas of contemporary debate, where as public historians there is a contribution to be made, where history and politics interacts, where public historians have helped to shape thinking and decision making, and then I'll end with some reflections on the role and function of public historians. And the first sort of example I'd want to look at was the Scottish referendum. Here, a popular decision to be taken about ending what I would see as one of the most successful political unions in global history. And a debate, I think, heavily influenced by historical understanding and the contribution of public historians within it. And in a sense, in the contemporaneous debate, obviously, the works of Neil Acheson and Tom Devine, Patrick Harvey, enormously important. But then so much of the sort of lead up to that debate, certainly from a Labour perspective, obviously going back to Linda Colley and her work on Britons and the forging of the nation. It's one of the sort of, I think, quite interesting ironies of history is that, you know, Gordon Brown was very drawn to Linda's work, and you'll hear from David Cannadine later, and yet everything he sought to deny the historical validity of her case, which is that if, as it were, Britain was forged in the 18th century under Protestantism, empire, war, sort of anti-French sentiment, if those components had then fallen away by the late 20th century, as it were, the building blocks of Britishness from a sort of historical perspective were under intense pressure. Gordon's response to that was, as it were, to renew a British identity, reforge a British identity, even as it were, the historical building blocks of that had collapsed. So I think Linda's work was enormously important in how we understood the UK and the meaning and nature of modern British identity and the conjunction of the various nations within the UK, even if the political lessons weren't learnt from it. But what we also, I think, saw in the debate in the referendum was not, you know, Braveheart, was not actually Walter Scott. It was not a sort of invented tradition of history which the Scottish people could wallow in. Actually, it was a very sophisticated and well-argued idea of what the Scottish nation was and what it could be, with a very strong role for public historians within that. And I think Tom Devine's new book about Scottishness and Scottish identity is continuing that. And clearly this argument isn't going to go away. And I think the historical unionist voice within that conversation, the public historian as unionist, apart from a few transatlantic scholars mainly, was nowhere near as powerful as it could or should be. You could make a similar case, I think, about Englishness and English identity, and what we see, I think, with Robert Tombs's latest work on the history of England is in many ways something of a kind of response to some of those debates about Scottish identity in recent years. So the Scottish referendum would be my first sort of case study. My second would be the Arab Spring and 1848, and I think you saw some very interesting attempts to place some of the popular movement, the suppression, the consequences of what took place in numerous Middle Eastern countries within a historical context of 1848, 1849. I think this was sort of less successful on any number of grounds, both kind of intellectual and polemical, but placing being able to position a series of what to the British public mind seemed unrelated and pretty complicated events in the Middle East within a historical context which could frame it was also rather interesting. I mean, Anne Applebaum, I think, wrote very interestingly on connecting what was happening there back to 1848, and then everyone obviously reached for A.J.P. Taylor of a turning point that failed to turn, and the aftermath of it. But where I think history and politics has really come alive is the debate on austerity and Keynes, and the approach to public finances in the UK and America, and the sort of the memory of the 1920s and 1930s. As you will know, in May 2010, when the coalition government was elected, George Osborne committed as his primary objective was the reduction and the elimination of the deficit. Actually, it was meant to happen by last year. He hasn't quite got there yet. But then a series of, marked reductions in public expenditure, with a very explicit goal of reducing the amount the state spent. He wanted to reduce the public sector share of the economy from 45% in 2010, which is obviously a big high based on the back of the banking crash, to 39.5%. And now, as it were, hot off the press, he's announced today he wants it down to 36.9% as a clear political tactic. And what you saw in the aftermath of this, and what you're still seeing, is the debate, the kind of really fascinating debate, I think. It got a bit sort of ping pong, but between the kind of Paul Krugman and Robert Skidelsky view of Keynes and Keynes's legacy and approach, and the Neil Ferguson interpretation of austerity, and the battle over Keynes's sort of cold body, and how he would have seen the contemporaneous decisions on public finances explored through history was really, really interesting, because you also at the same time had the counterfactuals about, as it were, the cost of austerity. The result, the Keynesian argued, was pretty disastrous. The Office of Budget Responsibility concluded that austerity reduced GDP growth by 2% from 2010 to 2012, bringing the cumulative cost of austerity since 2010 to 5% of GDP. But by contrast, the sort of austerity historians were suggesting that fiscal stabilization contributed to a revival of confidence. You can't run large deficits with impunity, as it were, the counter factual. All of it, and if you can follow the sort of, there's a very brilliant sort of exchange between Skidelsky and Ferguson on this, which begins relatively politely. And then they sort of warm up. It doesn't take them long to warm up, actually. Basically, fighting this out, and it kind of won't go away in the sense of you don't know what to put a price on the cost of austerity, as it were, as a different political tactic. But it was, I think this moment was interesting as well, because, as it were, economists, famously in the words of the Queen, had got it so wrong. Why should we listen to them? Actually, economic historians had more purchase on this, and the collapse, and this is something we can sort of come on to maybe, the collapse of economic history and the unwillingness of scholars to go into economic history is one of the remarkable things of the last 20, 25 years. And part of the strength of Neil Ferguson's work is he can do the math. And you might disagree with that, all the rest of it, but the ability to popularize an understanding of economics and to follow the money and to explain how he has followed the money is really, really powerful, I think. Let me now turn to the teaching of history, because I think this is a field in which public historians have entered the political fray. And it's a sort of, quite understandable, it drives teachers mad, whether it's either politicians or sort of, historians who haven't taught, a year 4 on a Thursday afternoon for quite some time. But nonetheless, the history and the teaching of history attracts public historians into the fray, attracts us as historians into the conversation, because history, unlike the chemistry syllabus or the English literature also gets people going, or the French syllabus, has this broader civic component and this broader civic function and this broader political function, which speaks to a sort of deeper debate. And I don't think the words of the national curriculum are bad. The national curriculum sort of flatly states that the study of history fires pupils' curiosity about the past in Britain, interesting that, and the wider world. Pupils consider how the past influences the present, what past societies were like, and what beliefs and cultures influenced people's actions. They see the diversity of human experience and understand more about themselves as individuals and members of society. And I think in that context, what's also interesting about that in terms of the debate about education and history is just how much pressure we now place upon schools and teachers to pass on a historical inheritance. And Roger Scruton writes very beautifully about this, how, as it were, his idea of Britain and his idea of history comes from family and church and work and those other components of civil society, and as those are stripped away, we all love looking at that data about undergraduates don't know when the Battle of Waterloo is, or a march to Moscow or whatever it is, and we blame the teachers. But when you look at how people in the past inherited a broader sense of history, pinning it all just on the classroom seems to be a mistake. But of course, the big argument, the number of arguments was about British identity and the big dispute about whether through schools we were teaching a sense of we were prioritising enough the teaching of British history. And this obviously got everyone sort of very, very passionate. So Michael Gove's vision was to get away from what was described as, very brilliantly, as the yo sushi approach to history, where you sort of you pick up your salmon and your squid or whatever on the conveyor belt, but can't bring it all together, and instead he wanted a nice big sort of chronological sweep of British history. And such is the extraordinary power of secretaries of state in this country that my poor son now begins with the Stone Age. And when are we going to do the Fire of London? I'm like, dream on. That is a long, that is a long way away, young man. So we needed a deep chronological sweep. And Michael had all these wonderful sort of symposium, and he got Simon Sharma to sort of come and advise. And our children, Simon suggested, are being shortchanged of the patrimony of their story, for there can be no true history that refuses to span the arc, no coherence without chronology. And so the new curriculum was developed, and this sent sort of Richard Evans into apoplexy, because he thought that we shouldn't really sort of presage British history. And Michael in the past used to say there was something rather un-British about seeking to define Britishness. I mean, Richard Evans's point, as he said, was it makes far more sense to teach British children of South Asian or Afro-Caribbean background about the parts of the world where their families originated, the history of the Mughal Empire or of Benin or Oyo, for example. And I think this is one of these really interesting moments where historians, and I find myself in the middle of this, historians and politicians come apart, because unlike, I dare say, Richard, we spend a lot more time in schools. Now, you know, I'm sure Richard does incredible amounts of work in schools and goes to sixth forms and does it all. But when you see the level, and this isn't blaming the schools, this is just the sort of the basis, when you see the absence of historical understanding at such a basic level in so many of our schools, to have an interesting conversation about the relative merits of a sort of, you know, history of Nigeria versus the Mughal Empire versus Britain, actually just finding some time in the school curriculum to allow for the teaching of history, particularly at Key Stage 3, ages 11 to 14, is a killer. And also the incredible social injustice of this. I mean, I don't know if they've changed, but the figures were always horrifying, that something like 50% of kids in Richmond were doing history GCSE, and about 11% of kids in Knowsley were doing history GCSE. And that's a social justice issue. So if you think of history if you think of history as an inheritance, the fact that so many of those kids are being denied that is shocking. Before you get on to, you know, Nigeria versus the Mughal Empire, giving them a sense, and I think I go completely the other way from Richard, that in a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, it is more important to have a sense of the history of Britain as a, you know, with all its sort of nuances and contradiction and all the rest of it, than a disparate sense of histories. And we always sort of used to laugh at the American syllabus and, you know, A Nation Arisen and, you know, One Out of Many, and, you know, a very sort of Whiggish account. But, you know, that you did that because you were a nation of immigrants with different histories, and actually through the education system you had to forge some sense of civic identity and a component. And I think I would fall on the side of having more merit within that, of having more of a concentration of British history. The irony of all of this was that the curriculum allowed for this. The irony of all of this was actually the curriculum. Again, you've got David Campbell, I will explore this all in much richer detail. But the irony of all of this was that the curriculum allowed for that, and actually it was the space and the timetable rather than, I think, the actual subject matter, which was so very important. It becomes much more interesting and complicated with then the imposition of British values. And where do you teach then British values in a school? And again, when I was shadow education, it was this extraordinary moment. You would go around schools, you know, on the first half of October. You know, school, fine. You go around schools the second half of October, and suddenly the British values notice board had appeared. And it had a Union Jack around the edge, and you can see them on every school now, and there'll be a picture of the Queen, there'll be a picture of Big Ben, there'll be a double-decker bus, there'll be a Millennium Wheel, there will be something, as it were, multicultural, and there'll be something sort of multi-religious, and there'll be some words like tolerance or, you know, equality or justice or liberty or something on it. And it's like this, you might as well have sort of the Ofsted British values notice board or something, just to sort of absolutely you know, nail the point. And again, it speaks to the extraordinary centralism of the British education system and how it does it, but also this interaction between politics and history. And quite rightly, I think, you know, historians, you know, should be participating in these conversations. The lead inspector for history at Ofsted was a brilliant man who sort of, you know, dealt with ministers' foibles in a very, very good way, but was completely across the interests of scholarship and the interests of the academy within this, and then how to translate that into school. But I always used to say to colleagues, getting very upset that, you know, Michael was sort of, you know, introducing some terrible Whiggish vision of history that was destroying our sort of pluralist approach. That, you know, come to any of my schools in Stoke-on-Trent, and this is not. There is a different battle to be fought about the place of history and the teaching of history and the professional development of history teachers in our schools, rather than the thing we all enjoy in the sort of comment pages of the Times Higher or the Guardian or History Today about the nature of British identity and history teaching. Let me leave you with some thoughts and then have a conversation about this history-politics interaction. First of all, as I'm sure you sort of know, we do have, and I think, of course there are strong traditions of public history in India and France and America, but I think we are good at it in this country. I think we place value on it. I think public history is important. I think we're good at it. I think we're good at writing biographies. I think we're good at making television series. I think we're good at making radio series. I think we're good at making films. I think our sort of physical, as it were, public history, I think our curators are amongst the best in the world. I think our museums are amongst the best in the world. I think our heritage attractions are amongst the best in the world. And the gallery directors and the curators and the archivists are amongst the best in the world. And you go to other nations and see other museums, and actually we're world leaders in this. And this is something that you as the coming generation will take forward. And I think you should be proud of the places you're in. I think you are leaders in this field, and we are international leaders. In this field. So we need to keep working at it, but to be involved at the level you're involved in at public history in the UK means that actually you're involved at an incredibly high level internationally. I think you also enter being public historians at a really receptive time. It seems to me universities are much more willing to allow it and support it. I love impact. I think impact is good. I don't like the forms, but I think the philosophy is good. It's so different to the old days. My old politics tutor back in Cambridge, he's now the professor, David Runciman, used to a long time ago write when he was a junior research fellow in Cambridge, used to write a column for G2, mainly about baseball actually in America. And there was, but as a sort of public intellectual thinking about these things in an interesting way, he did this column, and there was this sort of savage internal inquiry in the college as to how he could do this and why and all the rest of it. Whereas now it'd be sort of, So what's my advice, such as it is? My advice is to travel as much as possible, take every bloody bursary scheme, opportunity as possible. To position to understand yourselves in an international context is hugely important. Secure your academic credentials. Your strength, your brand strength as a public historian is a product of your academic expertise. Without that, everything is shot to pieces, and that has to be protected and nurtured and supported at all times. You cannot do one without the other. Why is Mary Beard fantastic? She's fantastic for all sorts of reasons, but she's fantastic because she's a brilliant scholar. And the public see through, as we know in the Labour Party, the public can see through a lack of authenticity, a lack of depth, a lack of understanding, and what they look for is authenticity and excitement and provocation. Once that is secure, I think be bold about where your thinking can go. Don't be afraid to range more widely from your sort of secure base. What are the areas that you can pursue? Building up a clear and distinctive voice is important, and that means, on the one hand, you have to sort of secure your academic base. On the other hand, you have to de-footnote yourself The problem with academic writing, which I'm sure you sort of discussed, is the vital importance of intervening in a debate. which in the outside world no one has a clue about or is interested in. And so, as it were, you get your points within academia by showing that you've made this vital intervention which has moved things along. Outside of academia, that is much less important. What is important is how your work is interesting and relevant to the present and sheds new light on the present. And it's a different style of writing, and it's a different style of thinking. What you need to do, obviously, is own a territory. You need to own and protect a territory, and whether that's a person, a period, a country, a sort of movement, you need to sort of own a niche, and then once you've owned it again, you go forward. Obviously, you need to be on the ball. You need to use events and issues and moments, and think creatively about how they highlight your work and what you can gain from that. And that means, and this is where I sort of this is where you reach the limits of my sort of knowledge base. When I was beginning work as a sort of public historian 15 years ago, whatever, obviously you consume all the newspapers, and you understand the rhythms of a newspaper, and you understand the rhythms of the radio, and think how you use it. The internet, I imagine, has changed all of this, and so your ability to find where public debate is and public discourse is slightly different to where it was 15 years ago in terms of sort of print media and broadcast media. Now, you will be more across this than me, but the principle remains the same, that you need to be up to date and have a feel for the rhythms, the style, and the sort of predilections of whether it's websites or comment pages or wherever it lands. I think you need to absolutely put yourself out there, and that means regional media and literary festivals and public speaking engagements, and the thing that you benefit from. The thing you sort of often try and seek not to do, of going to talk to the sixth form college or go and do it. Just building up a bank and the ability as a public speaker and to speak openly and fluently is really powerful, and you only gain that through multiple attempts, and there's a craft to it, which you kind of need to learn, and then just show you love your subject. Why have you come into this? Why do you do it? Why are you so passionate about it? Why do you want other people to know what you know, and the excitement and the interest and the relevance around it? And once you've got that, and once people are as excited as you are by what you seek to know and what you seek to explain, then you've caught their attention. But I would say that the connection to that is to make it germane and relevant to public debate. History is different. History is part of our civic discourse. History has a contemporaneous relevance, and even if we're sort of surrounded by the architecture of it in the House of Commons, and we don't always reflect enough on it, we need your voices to make it stronger. Thank you.